Howdy folks, and welcome to the Tank Museum at Bovington once again for Tiger Day 9, an event that took place this year on the 28th of April. A cold and windy day, although thankfully not a cold and wet one, although since I was sitting in the VIP enclosure in a nice big open front tent, it wouldn't have really mattered if it had been cold and wet. But everybody else might have gotten a little bit upset. So yeah, Tiger Day 9. I did cheat slightly for Tiger Day 9 this year. I went down a day early when I knew the museum was going to be a little more quiet and managed to get things like the Vehicle Conservation Centre all to myself. This is what the Vehicle Conservation Centre at the Tank Museum looks like when you've got the place all to yourself. Remember, they only open this place 3 times a year to the public. That's the 2 Tiger Days and Tank Fest. And it's jam-packed full of people. Also, this is where Wargaming tend to have their display, so it's even busier. Having the place to yourself is an absolute luxury. Let's take a closer look at some of the gems on display in here. Beginning with that unique tank there, tucked in between the Sherman and the Churchill. That is the only surviving T-14 heavy tank in the world. Only 2 were made. Britain had one and America had one, but the Americans destroyed theirs. And ours isn't in that much better condition, which is why it's sitting in the Vehicle Conservation Centre. Apparently the bottom has rotted out of it. But they keep it in here in as clinical a condition as they possibly can to hopefully prevent it from deteriorating any further, so that if one day they eventually raise the money to restore it, it's not going to be any worse off than it already is. Another view from the front. When I first started playing World of Tanks, this was the first heavy tank I ever owned. It was a Tier 5 Premium, well, it still is, and I was absolutely terrible in it, but the tank itself isn't too bad. Speaking of tanks, of which only 2 prototypes were ever made, and only one of which survives to this day, which also happen to be Tier 5 Premium heavy tanks in World of Tanks, it's the Excelsior. Designed as a replacement for the Churchill, which in 1942 was considered to be too slow and unreliable, but by the time this thing had been developed, the problems had been ironed out and the Churchill was actually not that bad after all, so this was cancelled. And while we're on the subject of extremely rare prototypes, that tucked away at the back there with the monstrous 120mm gun, and the huge turret is the FE 4004 Conway, tank destroyer based on the hull of the Centurion. Let's have a look around. What else can we see? What can we see that World of Tanks fans might recognise? Hello? That looks a lot like a Panzer of some type. Well, I'll give you a clue. It's in World of Tanks, but it isn't a Panzer. Let's take a closer look. This thing's actually Swedish. To take a closer look, we're just going to pull back over the rear of the tank from the front of the Excelsior. Shout when you know what it is. Swedish flag on the side. Right there. 2 machine guns in the front of the turret and an anti-tank gun. That's the Swedish M40L, which is basically an upgraded and modernised version of the Swedish L60 light tank. Let's have another look around. We're looking for things that kind of stand out from the crowd, things that you might not typically expect to see in a British tank museum, like that French oscillating tank turret. Is that perhaps an AMX 1375? Because they do have one at the tank museum, but no, it's not. In fact, that's not even a tank, that's an armoured car. That's a Panhard EBR with a 90mm gun in the French AMX 13 oscillating tank turret. The French and the Portuguese tended to use them in their colonial wars in Algeria, Mozambique, Angola, places like that. Places where the bad guys didn't typically have tanks or even anti-tank weapons. Moving back a little, it's not a particularly rare machine, but it is a very popular one, the M41 Walker Bulldog. That one actually belonged to New Zealand. New Zealand bought 10 of them in 1960 to replace their Stuarts and Valentines. Just think about that for a second. New Zealand, the country that brought you the Bob Semple tank. the tank that made the TOG 2 look like the pinnacle of armoured warfare development. We're still using Stuarts and Valentines as late as 1960, when they bought 10 of these to replace their entire tank fleet. And they were still using these until the early 1980s. 10 tanks, that was it. But it's New Zealand. Everybody loves the Kiwis. I mean, who's going to invade them? 10 tanks is fine. Anyway, moving on swiftly, let's take a closer look at some of the more rare machines on display in here. Here's a slightly closer view of the FE 4004 Conway with that monstrous 120mm gun. Huge turret built on the chassis of the Centurion, as is pretty apparent just from looking at it. But tucked in behind the convoy is something that's also probably going to be very familiar to World of Tanks players. It's the FV4202 prototype. Always thought this was a strange choice to be included in World of Tanks because it was never intended to be a production tank. Instead, what they were prototyping with the FV4202 was various design concepts that were going to be put into the Chieftain, such as the reclined driver's position, and as you can see here, the turret that doesn't actually have a gun mantlet. And in case you're wondering why the gun is at such a high elevation angle, it's because the gun isn't actually attached to anything inside the turret. It's been punched clean off its mountings and is just kind of resting there. Now we come on to something that I never tire of looking at when I'm in the VCC, and which most people have never even heard of. What do you think that is? Kind of looks a bit like an APC, doesn't it? Well, it's not. Let's take a look at the front of the hull. That's not even armour plate. This is just a proof of concept. That's just sheet steel. And it kind of looks as if something was bolted to the front of the hull and has since been removed. What do you suppose that might be? It's actually on the back, sitting on the top. That's a fake gun. It's a dummy 120mm gun, and this is a Chieftain proof of concept for a tank destroyer. And they did prove that the whole concept would work. But then somebody put their hand up and asked the question, yes, but why? I mean, if you have a Chieftain with a working turret and a fantastic 120mm gun, what's the point of taking the turret off and mounting the gun to the front of the hull? Oh yes, they all said. That's actually a very good point. So yeah, we'll cancel this project, but they did prove at least that it would have worked. And that's what it would have looked like. Not entirely dissimilar, I'm sure you'll agree, to the FV217 Badger tank destroyer that you can also play in World of Tanks. Although, as I understand it, the Badger was based on the hull of the Centurion, and this would have been an attempt to do the same thing with the hull of the Chieftain. Wandering around further, we have a couple of Leopard 1s, 2 of the 3 that the Tank Museum own. The third one is a Canadian Leopard, and you'll be seeing that thing in action later on. Then we have some of the World War I replicas flanking the museum's M103, the German A7V there, and the British Mark IV, both replicas unfortunately. The only surviving authentic A7V German World War I tank in the world is actually in Australia. And they're very lucky to have it because the Germans only built 17 in the first place. Tucked away behind the replica Mark IV, we've got the Universal Carrier, another one of my favourites, and then behind that we have what I first thought was some kind of Italian tankette. But it's actually the UE Chenilette, which is basically a tractor for towing guns. They did consider sticking a turret on top and turning it into a light tank, but probably very wisely decided not to bother. Of course, at some point I had to stop looking at tanks and go out and meet my adoring public. But I have to say the Tank Museum have always looked after us very well in this regard. Last year at Tankfest they had a marquee tent outside the front of the museum, which was great for Tankfest because it's June, July. It's usually quite warm, but Tiger Day was in April, and April is the wettest and windiest month in the UK, so this time around they gave us one of their conference suites. This is the Sherman Suite, it's actually inside the museum itself. So if people wanted to queue up and say hello, and there were a fair few of you who wanted to queue up and say hello, you at least got to do it inside instead of outside in the cold and wet. And it is always nice to meet you all, although I do always have this fear that you're going to meet me and end up going away disappointed. And yet you all seem to keep coming back. So, you know, that was nice. And then, of course, once we'd done the meet and greet, Rita and I split up to head out to various points around the Tank Museum and get some filming done ahead of the big armoured display in the arena in the afternoon. Now, if you're trying to find Rita in the Tank Museum, there are usually two places you can guarantee she won't be too far away from. One, of course, is her beloved A39 Tortoise, or Le Tortoise as she refers to it, and the other is a slightly less famous Australian tank, the AC-1 Sentinel. Yeah, I thought I might find you here. Oh, no particular reason.
I was taking photos for science.
Science, yeah?
Personal research.
Personal research, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Rita, you are so predictable. This is something you might not have seen in a video of the Tank Museum before. This is a Centurion tank that's been sectioned. It's been split right down the middle, so you can actually see what the conditions were like inside. Now remember, this is a Western tank, so conditions inside were actually quite spacious and luxurious, compared to, for example, a Russian tank. But still, I mean, wow. Small tank! It's another one of my favourites, the Panzer II Luchs, the world's cutest tank. And behind it, you may have seen this before, it's a Finnish T-26. The Finns also use the swastika, although slightly different to the Germans. Captured, of course, from the Russians, as most of the Finnish armour was. Now this is something that I had seen before. If you believe the sign on the front, it's an M10 tank destroyer, although it does say that it has the British 17-pounder gun. And these are British markings. And those are British 1937 pattern webbing packs strapped to the side of the turret. But those are American Army helmets. So, is it an M10, or is it an Achilles with a personality crisis? Technically, I suppose the Achilles is the M10, just with a British 17-pounder gun, but just when you thought things couldn't get more confusing, here's a Covenanter that's called Achilles. I swear they're doing it just to confuse me at this point. It is always nice coming back to the Tank Museum, no matter how many times you've been here. There's the old favourites like the Su-76 here, which was both a tank destroyer and a self-propelled gun, and very, very successful. And the mighty KV-1, a very, very strong tank. But as well as your old favourites like the surprisingly big Jagdpanther sitting next to the Jagdpanzer 38T Hetzer, there's always something new that you haven't seen before as well. And there's currently a brand new exhibition in the Tank Museum full of things like, well, this. The Boarhead Combat Vehicle. If you're wondering why the description is in Dutch and English, is because this new exhibition in the Tank Museum was partially funded by, of all people, the Dutch. Actually, the Tank Museum's been doing very well out of the Netherlands lately because they've also got exclusive use of the Royal Netherlands Army Leopard 2 for the rest of the year. More on that later. Some of these designs you may have seen before. This is the ball tank. The idea was that the two hemispheres of the tank would be capable of rotating independently, and that's how the whole thing would turn. Still doesn't seem like a terribly practical idea. Even less practical is this American design. This is the electric tank. Just take a closer look at this, for example. Have a look at the fighting compartments. There's one underneath the central wheel. There's a sort of box there with gun slits in it, but look at that. Who thought that was a good idea? Possibly the same people who thought this was going to be a good idea. Yep, this is the famous Land Cruiser. That's a German heavy cruiser turret mounted on the top. Those are 203mm guns. You can also see some flak panzer turrets mounted sort of midships towards the rear. And those smaller turrets at the back, those are turrets from the Maus. And just for comparison's sake, that's how big your typical German soldier would have been standing next to it. Some of you may have also seen this thing. This is the Chrysler atomic tank. The prototype, of which one was built, was actually powered by a Chrysler V8, but there were proposals to fit an atomic power plant to this thing. The strange turret would have contained the whole crew and would have been completely sealed against radiation. The last thing in this particular new exhibition is a look to the future. This is the Ground X vehicle, which is apparently, at least in the concept stage, with the US Department of Defense. Now, what I don't know is whether or not this is intended to be a manned vehicle, whether or not it's going to be a remote-controlled drone vehicle, or whether or not it's intended to be completely autonomous. I hope not completely autonomous, because I can't help but look at this thing and think of this. Well, okay, maybe we're not quite that advanced just yet, but hey, well, you know, it's going to happen. You let these tanks start to think for themselves, and you wake up and suddenly Terminators everywhere. Hollywood would never lie to us. Oh, hang on, I've seen Fury. Yeah, okay, never mind. Speaking of Fury and other tanks, like, you know, Tiger 131, the whole reason for Tiger Day, and the reason why most people were coming down to the Tank Museum for Tiger Day, the opportunity to see the only operational Tiger tank in the world being put through its paces here in the arena at the Tank Museum. Of course, first they're going to tease you with some other tanks. And normally when I'm turning up at the Tank Museum to film one of these events, I have a bit of a problem because there's a there's a specific area set aside for the press where they can film and photograph to their heart's content. And it's on a sort of raised grass bank over to the right-hand side of the camera here. The problem is that there are no loudspeakers over there, so you don't get any of the commentary that's been given to accompany the display of the tanks in the arena by people who know a damn sight more about tanks than I do. This time around, because I was in the VIP enclosure, which was a nice big tent with a nice big open front, so I could film without anything getting in the way, well, almost anything. I must apologise, by the way, in this year's Tiger Day video, we're going to be guest starring red-jacketed big head man. Don't worry, you'll know who he is when you see him. But I couldn't exactly poke him with a stick and tell him to get out of the way, because he was in my shot. Because, you know, he'd paid for a ticket just the same. Well, in fact, I didn't even pay for a ticket. I was there as a VIP guest of the Tank Museum, so that guy had more right to be there than I did. And I certainly wasn't going to poke him and say, "Don't you know who I am? Get out of my shot, you peasant." So we're just going to have to put up with it. And my plan at this point was to just hand you over to the commentary that was being provided live by the Tank Museum's experts, because I was finally in a position where, well, you can see all of the loudspeakers. There's the star of today's show, Red Jacket Big Head Man. Hello, say hello to YouTube. We're going to be seeing a lot of him. But while I was finally in a position, or so I thought, to actually capture the commentary given over the loudspeaker system by the Tank Museum's experts, and I'd actually be able to shut up and let the experts tell you what it was you were looking at, the noise of the tank engines on the video was just too loud, and every time the tank got close, you just couldn't hear what the experts were saying. So I'm just going to have to keep talking, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. This is the first time I've actually seen a Chieftain on the move, by the way. You might think that's surprising, given that I'm British, and if there's one thing that we're not short of, even though they've been retired from service, it's Chieftain tanks. And we're not short of Chieftain tanks. The Tank Museum must have half a dozen of them. But I think this is the only one it's got that works. The Chieftain, of course, had the legendarily unreliable L60 British Leyland engine. Anybody who knows anything about British cars, as soon as I say British Leyland, they suddenly understand why the Chieftain's engine was so bad. It's not, of course, completely fair to lay the blame squarely at the door of British Leyland, because they did have a fairly difficult problem when it came to designing the engine for this thing. It's something I've talked about before. The basic short version of it is NATO decided they want multi-fuel engines because if Russia ever invaded the West, you wouldn't be able to guarantee a diesel or petrol supply for your tanks. So they wanted tanks that would run on diesel or petrol, aviation fuel, or even cooking oil if they had to. Everybody thought, yeah, that's a great idea, but the British were the only ones that went ahead and did it. Everybody else realised, actually, no, this is terrible. Trying to get an engine that will work on all these different kind of fuels just means it's terrible on all of them. So they all very wisely decided to go with diesels. But not the British. No. No, we stuck to our guns and we put the worst tank engine ever into this thing. And ironically, despite the fact that it was capable of running on a huge variety of different fuel types, the British Army Chieftains with their L60 multi-fuel British Leyland engines never once ran on anything other than diesel. And it wasn't even that it was as simple a case of, okay, you want to run diesel, fine, the engine's set for diesel. You want to run an aviation fuel, flip a switch, the engine now runs. No. It took a troop of Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers something like 8 hours to do the necessary modifications to the engines of these tanks to make them run on anything other than diesel. And they didn't run on diesel very well at all. The engines were terrible. Much has been said about the legendary unreliability of the engine of these tanks. The fact that they actually managed to get this thing running and not break down and embarrass the museum in front of the whole audience was a bit of a miracle. Other than the engine, absolutely fantastic tank. Speaking of very good tanks, the American M60. The Americans took a slightly, well, a completely different design approach to their post-war tanks to the British. We were pushing out massively armoured, with extremely powerful gun tanks like the Chieftain. And for a time, the Americans were doing this as well with the M103, which was another very, very good tank, beloved by its crews with a very, very powerful gun. But the M103 didn't last very long, and instead they just basically continued developing what were basically M26 Pershings from World War II. Very late in World War II, but still World War II. Particularly if you look at the back, the rear of the engine and the sort of boat-shaped hull. You can quite clearly see the evolution from the M26 Pershing through to the M48 pattern through to the M60 pattern. Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, they had something that worked and worked well, and they just kept evolving the design, and they ended up with the M60. Very, very good tank. In fact, the US Marine Corps was still using M60s in the first Gulf War. Seriously upgraded M60s, but still M60s nonetheless. Now, I'm sure they would have used M1 Abrams if they'd had the money, but they didn't, because they're the US Marine Corps and they tend to get whatever funds the US Navy has left. That's always been the way with the US Marine Corps. They've always been the we'll just make do with what we've got branch of the US military, and they do a very, very good job with it. But they certainly liked their M60s in the first Gulf War. And they knocked out a few T-72s with them as well. So, very, very good tanks, despite the fact that there was nothing really revolutionary in the design about them. This is kind of frustrating, because you can almost hear that commentary in the background, and at points, if I were to shut up and turn the volume up, you would hear the commentary in the background, but just as it's about to say something really, really interesting and pertinent to the tank that you're watching, the tank gets a bit closer, and suddenly all you can hear is the tank's engine. In fact, you know what, I'm going to shut up for a bit, just so you can actually hear the tank's engine, because they are quite impressive. So here's what an M60 sounds like. It's not bad, is it? Trust me, it's nothing compared to a Leopard, which I think is the next tank that's coming out. So, yeah. Who wants to hear what a Leopard sounds like? Well, you're going to have to wait for a bit, because it's not the next tank to come out. First, we're just going to have to settle for the star of the show. No, not Red Jacket Big Head Man. Tiger 131 herself. You ready for this? Because this is basically what everybody comes to Tiger Day and Tankfest for. It's the world's only operational Tiger tank. The Tank Museum's very own Tiger 131. She is pretty impressive, isn't she? That Maybach engine. They're actually, well, it's not so much that they have a problem with this Maybach engine, but I don't know how much of that Maybach engine is still the original Maybach engine, because the Germans designed a good engine, but it's not going to last 70 years. They've obviously had to replace gears and all sorts of things with it, but there's a limit to just how long you can make that kind of engine last. And what they're actually planning to do with Tiger 131 now is build a second engine for her. Luckily, they've almost finished on their new vehicle workshop, which is having its official royal opening on the 18th of May this month. It's going to be opened by Princess Anne, and I've been invited along to go and meet some royalty at the opening, so hooray. But what they've got inside this new workshop are facilities not just to properly restore tanks, because the workshops that they have at the Tank Museum aren't bad, but they're really only suitable for maintenance on the running tanks. They have limited facilities to do restoration. For example, the Matilda II, which has almost completed restoration and is going to be running out sometime this month as well, fully restored to its original condition. But these new workshops that they have, they've got much, much better facilities, not just for restoring tanks and keeping them properly sealed away from the environments and effects like rust and erosion and so on, but they've also got cranes inside there so they can take the turrets off tanks indoors. and swap out power packs. So the plan is to, from scratch, build a brand new Maybach engine so that they don't have to keep running Tiger 131 on the same engine and risk the thing breaking down completely. So that's great news for the Tank Museum, and it's great news for us as well, because, well, the Tank Museum have always had a bit of a problem with Tiger 131. And it's a good problem to have, but it's a problem nonetheless. As the world's only operational Tiger tank, you obviously want to show the thing off, because it's, you know, it's the jewel in the crown of the Bovington collection here at the Tank Museum. The problem, of course, is you don't want to show it off too much, because it's a very, very old and delicate machine, and you don't want it to break down. And if it breaks down, you can't do Tiger Day. And, well, you can still do Tank Fest, but you can't show Tiger 131 off. So these new workshop facilities are going to be great in that they're going to be able to keep this old girl running for many, many years to come. And that's great for the Tank Museum, and it's great for us. Incidentally, while we're looking at Tiger 131, I'm sure many of you are aware of the story of how Tiger 131 was captured, although interestingly this year some new evidence has come to light to indicate that Tiger 131 wasn't captured at the exact spot where they had until now thought it had been captured. It actually happened several miles further away, still in North Africa, but during a different battle. But the circumstances around the capture were that a Churchill tank managed to score a hit on the gun mantlet, which in itself wasn't going to do any damage to the tank, but the shot then ricocheted down into the turret ring and jammed it. And the crew, having already taken a hit in the driver's hatch, which sent splinters down into the head of the driver and didn't cause any serious injury, but blood everywhere, suddenly confronted with Churchill tanks at point-blank range and unable to rotate the turret and fire at them, the crew panicked and abandoned the tank without destroying it. Well, I managed to actually get some footage, because the impact of where that Churchill's gun actually struck the gun mantlet and the damage to the turret ring has been preserved by the Tank Museum, so you can still see it to this day, and this is what it looks like. So if we get in closer, you can see how the shot came in under the gun barrel, kind of lightly gouged a couple of marks out of the barrel sleeve, and then went down and carved a wedge out of the gun mantlet itself, and then went down, and you can see the impact in the turret ring. And that's the shot that disabled Tiger 131. Now what's remarkable about this is that 70 years later you can still see it. The tank's been repainted countless times in the 70 years that it's been captured, but they've never once painted over those marks under the barrel sleeve where the initial 6-pounder shot impact occurred. They've never filled in the damage done to the gun mantlet or the turret ring, because these are important parts of the history of the tank. A lot of people will get an old banged up tank and will spend a lot of money and do a fantastic job of restoring it to its original condition, but that was never the aim with Tiger 131. It's been restored to running order, but it's been preserved in the original condition in which it was captured. And that's the difference between a tank that's in somebody's collection and a tank that's in a museum, like the Tank Museum at Bovington. It's all about the preservation of history. Oh look, it must be Leopard time. Okay, I'm going to shut up now, because if you haven't heard a Leopard before, you need to hear this.
They sat down, firstly with the French, to try and build what was going to be called the steam answer. As we said, so the curtains ready for the Leopard 1, and amazingly our old mate Ferdinand.
I have to admit the video doesn't really do it justice, even if you've got a big subwoofer. It's just not the same as being there. And I've told the story before about the first time I was close to a Leopard 1 when it was going at full throttle. See, I was never a fan of the Leopard. I always thought, German fanboy tank. Give me a Chieftain any day of the week. Give me a Challenger. I didn't really get the point. When a Leopard does 60 kilometers per hour within 10 meters of you, it makes your lungs rattle. Okay? It's a feeling. There's no other feeling in the world like it, except perhaps for being the same distance from a Leopard 2 when it goes roaring past at 60 kilometers per hour. But hang on, here it comes. I'm going to shut up and let you hear it again.
Diesel in the back of this vehicle. The original Leopards were only people at 30 inside, and they got that 105 down the L7.
first time I ever heard a Leopard going past at full speed was also the first time Rita had ever heard a Leopard going past at full speed. And while I thought I'd had a religious experience, I turned around and looked at Rita, and she looked like she needed to go and change her underwear. She's been a big fan of the Leopard ever since as well. And for good reason, because it is an amazing tank. You see, while the British were building, influenced by their experience against Panthers and Tigers during the Second World War, of course, the British were concerned that they were never ever again going to go into battle with a tank that was going to be outgunned and out-armoured by the enemy. Hence the Chieftain. The Germans, on the other hand, took a very, very different approach. With the advances in shape charge ammunition which were happening at the time, the German designers thought, well, there's no point in just putting more and more armour on a tank, because there's always going to be a shell that's going to defeat that armour. So instead, let's have a gun that is capable of defeating all that armour and put it on the fastest tank imaginable. And that's basically what the Leopard is. The armour is functional, but its mobility is its main defence, and it is very, very good at it. It's also, it doesn't hurt that it's beautiful to look at as well. Damn you Germans. You keep making great tanks. Stop it, it's not funny anymore. But wait, there is one more great German tank to come. Kindly loaned to the Tank Museum by the Dutch Army, and in fact loaned to the Tank Museum for the rest of the year, so you can probably expect to see it at Tankfest and at Tiger Day 10 later on this year as well. It's the Dutch Army Leopard 2 A4, and here it comes.
Ground vehicle, and of course, if you've got enough money, you don't have to buy every one of them. You can get one like this. This is the Leopard 2, this particular one. What happens is the Germans in the 70s, well, almost actually immediately Leopard 1 goes into service, they start work on the Leopard 2. And what you're looking at here is a Leopard 2 A4, that was bought by the Dutch military, put into service with the Dutch Army. This particular one has been very basically historic vehicles to show off history, anniversaries, etc.
Yep, the German Leopard 2 main battle tank. For a while, the Chieftain was the most powerful main battle tank in the world. Until the Germans went and made this. It's just, seriously Germany, you're not impressing anybody, stop it. Of course we got our own back and went and made the Challenger, which is basically just a Chieftain underneath all of that fancy armour. It's basically just a Chieftain with a few extra bits and, you know, an engine that works. And then of course the Challenger 2, which is, despite its physical similarity to a Challenger 1, is actually a completely different machine underneath. Of course, the Germans just kept developing the Leopard 2 and kept pace with the Leopard 2 A5, the Leopard 2 A6, and so on and so on and so on. It really is a fantastic tank. There's not a huge difference between most of the current main battle tanks of Western and sometimes even Asian nations. If you look at the Challenger 2, you look at the M1 Abrams, you look at the Leopard 2, you look at the Korean K2 Black Panther. It's another amazing tank, and one that I've never actually seen, and I'm probably never going to. But you never know. Fingers crossed, one day, maybe, the Tank Museum will get a hold of one of those. Probably 20 years from now when they've been retired from service. But another amazing machine, and very, very similar in specifications and capabilities to the current crop of top-tier Western main battle tanks, like the Challenger 2, like the Leopard 2, and like the M1 Abrams. Of course, the problem that we're actually finding with the main battle tanks these days is that, very, very capable though they may be, and will continue to be for some years to come, is they're actually kind of old by now. You know, these tanks have been in service for quite some time, and the British are no different. We're looking at ways of upgrading our fleet of aging Challenger 2s, but we have a particularly unique problem. Unlike just about everybody else, we still use two-part ammunition and rifled guns on our tanks. And the British government, in their great wisdom several years ago, shut down the two factories that produced the ammunition for the Challenger 2. Because it's unique ammunition, we can't just buy it from anybody else, because we were the only ones who were making it. And the current ammunition stocks we're getting dangerously old. So that is a bit of a problem for us. And so, well, one of the ways that we're looking at getting around this problem is to go to the Germans and say, can you possibly redesign the turret of the Challenger 2 so it will fit a smoothbore gun and we can use everybody else's ammunition. If you want a job done properly, get the Germans to do it. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Anyway, politics aside, I hope you've enjoyed today's video, because that's pretty much it for Tiger Day 9 at the Tank Museum at Bovington. All that remains now is for us to put Tiger 131 back to bed in the Tiger collection where she belongs, next to the elephant. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed Tiger Day 9 at the Tank Museum, and I enjoyed meeting so many of you as well, and I hope I didn't disappoint you too much. I mean, I really hope it was worth the wait. And that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to leave the parking of Tiger 131 running in the background, and that's going to see us off for the day. In the meantime, of course, as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.
Again, it's arrived.